Hello everyone, Professor Kusluch here. So today we're going to talk about the media. So what it is, how it's evolved over time, and why it matters so deeply for American democracy. So as we talked about in class, when we say the media, we're referring to the institutions and technologies that collect, produce, and distribute information to the public. So this includes, of course, television, radio, newspapers, emerging online outlets, podcasts, social media platforms that dominate so much of our daily information environment. So, at its core, the media serves three essential democratic functions. First, it acts as a watchdog, monitoring government activity, exposing wrongdoing, educating the population about what the government's doing. Second, it sets the public agenda, deciding which issues receive attention and which fade into the background. We've all heard that about something that only lasted one media cycle or one news cycle, and then it seemingly isn't covered again. So when we think of agenda setting, the media is kind of deciding and choosing what to cover and what not to cover. And that does kind of shape our idea of what is important. And thus, the third feature of the media is it shapes public opinion, influencing not just what people think about, but how they think about it. So, that's what this video is going to be about. I'll try to keep it under 25 minutes here, try to keep it around 20 minutes. So the big question is, okay, so then let's start with what is the media? The framers of the Constitution viewed a free press as vital to liberty, so much that it's explicitly protected in the First Amendment. They understood that democracy cannot function if citizens lack access to independent information. Early American newspapers, we know, were partisan and oftentimes harsh, yet they contributed to and encouraged public debate. Today, the term the media encompasses far more than just print journalism. We have broadcast outlets, cable networks, if you sit down and watch TV, these cable networks, digital news sites, and an entire online ecosystem where virtually anyone can produce and share content. And we talked about and discussed some of the pros and cons of that. That it knocks down some of the gatekeepers, that it allows people who might not have had access to sharing political analysis before, now they can. But now we also see some drawbacks. We see the dissemination of misinformation and fake news. So, social media has changed our way that we consume media for better and sometimes for worse. This enormous expansion of information sources does bring then greater diversity of viewpoints, but also greater difficulty in sorting fact from fiction. At times, we are just so inundated with information. We are so just everywhere we look, there is information. It can be hard to decipher what is true and what is not true. So let's think for a minute about this evolution of the media. So we know in the 19th century, the press was local and deeply partisan. Editors of publication openly supported political parties, and newspapers were oftentimes funded by those parties. By the early 20th centuries, the rise of the penny press made newspapers cheaper and more accessible, while new technologies such as the telegraph and photography began transforming news into a mass product. So the next major shift really came with radio and television. We've all heard since we were little kids and we were learning civics and government and history about Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats, which emerged in the 1930s, brought the president directly into America's living room. A revolutionary change at the time to be able to hear the president speak directly to Americans. And by the 1960s, television networks ABC, CBS, NBC dominated national news. Anchors that we've all heard of, like Walter Cronkite, became trusted figures who could frame the day's events for millions of listeners, for millions of viewers. Then came television in the 1980s and the internet in the 1990s, and really the explosion throughout the 2000s, which ended the dominance of those traditional gatekeepers that we talked about. And so today, Americans can consume news tailored precisely to their interests or their ideological leanings, something that political scientists call narrowcasting. This fragmentation has also allowed for more voices to be heard, a greater amount of voices, remember, knocking down those gatekeepers, but it has also contributed to greater polarization, as people now can easily avoid information that challenges their views. As we talked about, when we tune into certain news publications, it's because they hold a similar worldview that we do. And so we just feel comfortable in that space. And so political scientists argue that this just leads to greater polarization. Okay, so we do know that there is some regulation of the media. A big debate that we hear today is about how and if places like social media should be regulated, or is it okay that people can say whatever they want on social media. So these debates that have evolved over time, we know they're not new, but the challenges of the social media era have brought new discussions. So let's just think for a minute about regulating the media. So government oversight of the media has always involved a delicate balance between protecting free speech and preventing harm. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, was created in 1934 to regulate radio and later television and internet communications. Early on, the FCC enforced the Fairness Doctrine, which required broadcasters to present contrasting views on controversial issues. The rule was repealed in 1987, paving the way for more opinion-driven radio and cable commentary. The Supreme Court has repeatedly protected the press from government censorship. In the New York Times versus the United States, 1971, the Pentagon Papers case, maybe you've heard of it as the Pentagon Papers, the court ruled that the government could not block publication of classified documents revealing information about the Vietnam War. However, yet courts have also recognized limits, such as libel laws and restrictions on obscenities. So today, new regulatory questions center on social media platforms. They are not traditional news outlets, but their algorithms shape the information millions of Americans see each day. So debates continue about whether companies like Meta or X and TikTok should be treated like neutral platforms or publishers responsible for content moderation. So, okay, let's think for a moment about the impact of the media. Media influence operates through what scholars call agenda setting, framing, and priming. So agenda setting, framing, and priming. So agenda setting, which has come up a few times throughout the class already, means the media determines which issues become public priorities. For example, sustained coverage of inflation or sustained coverage of immigration pushes those issues to the tops of voters' minds. It's kind of shaping what voters think are important issues. Framing refers to how the story is told. The same event can appear very different depending on whether it's described as an economic challenge or a moral crisis. So priming shapes how we evaluate leaders. If the news focuses on foreign policy, people judge presidents primarily on those achievements or those failures. So over time, we know that trust in media has declined. Surveys show that Americans believe news organizations are biased or politically motivated. In part, this stems from the 24-hour news cycle, where the pressure to break stories quickly and oftentimes before your competition oftentimes leads to errors or sensationalism. So we talked in class about sensationalism and its connection with social media. Social media has amplified this dynamic, blurring the line between professional journalism and personal opinion. So we can consider how coverage differs immensely between outlets. One network may frame a protest as an expression of civic engagement, while another highlights property damage or disorder, shows visuals showing that there was destruction and there was maybe mayhem in the streets. So we've all encountered this. You go to one news site and it looks like a peaceful protest. You go to another and it looks like a more violent protest. So this does give some criticism to the media, and we hear it. We hear it anecdotally in our own lives. People are frustrated about the framing and the agenda setting. Like, even if you're not super into politics, we hear this in our own lives. So both stories might be factually accurate. There might be a few people who are a problem and then the rest peaceful. But who gets highlighted in that story, we've experienced and encountered that. So both stories might be factually accurate, but the emphasis from the media can lead viewers to entirely different conclusions of what is going on. So digital media has really democratized information along with the smartphone. Anyone now with a smartphone can report news, share opinions instantly to the world. But this democratization has also opened the door, like we talked about, to misinformation and disinformation, especially when false stories spread far quicker than corrections or retractions. Those false stories, that misinformation can spread around the internet. Millions of people can view it before we even realize that, hey, that isn't really what happened. So during election seasons, we really see how quickly narratives can shape the perceptions of legitimacy, of turnout, and of trust. So algorithms themselves reward engagement, not necessarily accuracy, which means outrage and emotion often travel faster than nuance of the story or verification that everything is true. And so at the same time, younger generations are increasingly turning away from television and print platforms to platforms like TikTok, YouTube, Instagram for news where journalistic standards may vary. So in our in-class discussion, some students brought up some good quality sources they follow on social media, but we also see that there are less legitimate sources that people follow, that maybe we get tricked by or we get confused by or intentionally deceive us. So this raises some pretty complex questions about media literacy and the ability of citizens to distinguish credible reporting from manipulation and disinformation. So, despite these challenges, the media remains indispensable to democracy. Investigative journalism continues to uncover corruption, reveal abuses of power, and keep citizens informed about decisions that affect their lives. So, at the same time, the diversity of today's media landscape allows marginalized voices to reach audiences once excluded from national debates, from grassroots activists, live streaming protests, to local reporters covering communities that national outlets ignore. The social media revolution has allowed these voices to be heard by millions in a way that previously they could not have. So the key question then for democracy is not whether the media is perfect, they never have been, but whether citizens can critically evaluate the information they receive. Media literacy, education, transparent sourcing, and responsible consumption on our part as consumers of media all play vital roles in sustaining a healthy democracy. So just to close our thoughts here. So when we talk about the media, we're really talking about the information ecosystem that connects citizens to their government. It's the bridge between the political institutions and the public, but also a mirror reflecting who we are as a society. Understanding how media work, who owns them, and how they shape perceptions is essential civic knowledge. Okay, thank you.